We are studying the chapter titled The Great Transition, where Sri Aurobindo is describing the passage from our outer fringe, lower result, and inferior working of the world that we are familiar with, to the superconscient existence which has developed this, supports this, governs this, and is immanent in it, always one, conscious of itself, conscious of its omniscient and omnipotent force. And it secretly inspires and governs this domain. We are now as if inside, we may use the analogy of a fishbowl, where the larger world looks into this, nourishes it, feeds it, while helping the growth of this being, which is still like an immature child awakening to its own divinity, protected and supported and led, but secretly allowing it its sense of freedom and the personal choice. This transition, Sri Aurobindo has also described from the perspective of this consciousness in which we live. The mechanism, technology by which this limited, inferior world has been created by a double movement of negative and positive, which sets up a domain of dualities, where one, the negative, conceals the absolute, the positive nudges, pushes towards the absolute, and the two together are leading the journey, which is never fulfilled as long as you are within the duality. And therefore, the necessity for a transcendence to attain to that which we are seeking. But the question is, does that attainment involve abandonment of this world and a withdrawal into a different world? Or is that to be realized here in this world? And Sri Aurobindo has now brought attention to use of one word, preti. And he says the word used for going forward is that which expresses the passage of death. It is also that which the Upanishad uses for the forward movement of the life force, yoked to the car of embodied mind and sense on the paths of life. And in this coincidence we can find a double and a most pregnant suggestion. So there's a double suggestion, there's also a pregnant suggestion. And this is what Sri Aurobindo now elaborates in the paragraph that we are now reading. But this going across, he says, is possible by a consciousness of wisdom. Dhiraha is the term used. The wise, therefore the souls seated and accomplished in luminous thought power, put away from them the dualities of our mind, life and sense, and go forward from this world. They go beyond to the unity and the immortality. And this going beyond is the word used, preti, which has a double meaning here in the way the Upanishad uses it. Sri Aurobindo now describes this. It is not by abandoning life on earth in order to pursue immortality on other, more favorable planes of existence that the great achievement becomes possible. It is here, ihaiva, in this mortal life and body, that the immortality must be won. Here in this lower Brahman and by this embodied soul, that the higher must be known and then he puts in quotation marks, here one finds it not, great is the purpose. Now this we briefly read, now we will have to explore more deeply. Let's first look at the use of the word preti, and then this reference Sri Aurobindo makes to the word ihaiva, in this mortal life, in the body, that it has to be realized. And then this special quotation, if here one finds it not, great is the perdition. So all of these relate to texts in Sanskrit, and so we will first look at preti itself. The word, as last time we briefly touched upon, has the sense of forward movement. The word itself can be split into two roots, pra and eti. The two joining becomes preti. Eti is movement, often used to describe a coming or a going, a leap, but in some sense a movement. Pra is enforcing, intensifying, forcefully doing. So preti is a forceful movement, an intense movement. If you look up the dictionary, it will say preti equals departure. Equally it says arrival or approach or flight. But you can see in the root sound the meaning is not so mentally fixed. Any forceful movement which is necessary when you make a transition. That is, it's not a smooth passage from here to there, but a transition which requires a special effort of a breaking through. And therefore, this word is used in the passage of death. We mentioned this last time. It is not the forward movement of life in its normal course happening smoothly. It is a breaking through, a forceful transition, and so preti is the term used there. But the Kena Upanishad uses exactly the same term to describe the movement of life energy in the body, in the journey of life itself. You will recall verse 1 in the translation. Sri Aurobindo translates it, by whom yoked moves the first life breath forward on its paths. Yoked meaning the life force is attached to the body and the mind like the horse is attached to the chariot. In Sanskrit, kena prana prathama preti yuktaha. By whom? Kena, prana, life force, prathama, first. Preti, pushed forward, forcefully forward moving. Yukta, yoked to the body and mind. So by whom is this life force first pushed forward while yoked to the mind and life, and mind and body? Interestingly though, a variation of this word is also used in the very first line of the first verse, where it says, by whom missioned falls the mind shot to its mark. In Sanskrit, keneshitam patati preshitam manaha. Preti and preshitam. So I will make this similarity because in Sanskrit, recall the sound is identical with the meaning. So when two words have similar sounds, they also have similar meanings. But here, whom missioned the mind, so the missioned here is eshitam, says it, not preti, eshitam, and then mind shot to its mark. So this shot movement, the act of being shot, is preshitam. Preti, and within that you put esha, she, so preshitam, the she comes in. The she is also keneshitam, eshitam, that is the mind which is missioned. So missioned and shot to its mark, both there is a similarity, and the missioned joining with preti becomes shot to its mark, preshitam. So you can see a connection here throughout. There is intentionally in the vocabulary used by the Kena Upanishad a suggestion that is, even when mind is pursuing in our life the thing to which it is being pushed. It is the same kind of push that exists in the life force within us, which is driving this chariot carrying the mind and body. Then, the same word is used again in the second verse, where in the text, that which is hearing of our hearing, mind of our mind, speech of our speech, that too is life of our life breath and sight of our sight. And then it says, the wise are released beyond. And here comes the word, eshitam. The wise are released beyond and they pass from this world. It's not released, it is here. They pass from this world, eshitam. The wise are released beyond and they pass from this world and become immortal. So here is the word dhiraha, that is the wise, the steadfast. Pratyasma loka damrita bhavanti. Preti, so pretyasma lokat. Preti asmad loka, that is, they are pushed forward from this world, asmat, this loka, domain, and amrita, immortality, they attain, bhavanti, become one with immortality. So the wise are as if pushed or make this transition of preshitam into that of immortality. Preti, that's the word. Now you see this word has come several times and it is being used to describe the passage, the great transition from this lower Brahman into the higher spiritual, superconscient existence. It is also the word which is used to describe the life force driving, pushing us. It is also the word with a variation used to describe the mind being shot to reach its mark. And commonly the same term is used to describe the transition of death. And so the suggestion is obvious. He's saying it's not by abandoning life on earth that the great achievement becomes possible, because the Kena is using it to describe the drive of life force in the journey of life and the drive by which the mind is reaching its goal. So in the next sentence he says, this life force in us is led forward by the attraction of the supreme life on its path, of constant acquisition through types of the Brahman until it reaches a point where it has to go entirely forward, to go across out of the mortal life, the mortal vision of things, to some beyond. So there is this journey where there's the steady push. Life force is leading us a little more. I grow, I conquer, I overcome, I become more capable, I achieve more, I acquire more, and so on. But there's some point where there is a breakthrough required. That breakthrough takes two forms. The first is where we are forced by the passage of death to break out from the limitation of this journey, momentarily taste a different consciousness, but that is not in itself the goal, and therefore we come back, take birth again, and continue the journey. And you see here that momentary retasting of some experience of a consciousness of immortality is as if a nourishment, a regeneration, a support from which now this journey can continue. So this Sri Aurobindo writes, so long as death is not entirely conquered, this going beyond is represented in the terms of death and by a passing into other worlds where death is not present, where a type of immortality is tasted, corresponding to that which we have found here in our soul experience. But the attraction of death and limitation is not overpassed, because they still conceal something of immortality and infinity which we have not yet achieved. Therefore, there is a necessity of return. an insistent utility of farther life in the mortal body, which we do not overcome until we have passed beyond all types to the very being of the infinite, one and immortal. So it's as if the real journey is taking place in the mortal life. Death is a passage which allows us momentarily to experience a certain represented state of immortality, only so that we can come back to complete something here which we have missed. And this connects to the earlier discussion where he pointed out that in the duality of this world, there is a negative side and the positive side, and the negative side is concealing. It is concealing that great truth. And so as long as that great truth has not been discovered here, death becomes inevitable. Because death is concealing that great truth. When you get it, now the concealing layer is removed. And now you have it. Death is no more required. Until then, life is nudging you towards there but cannot get to it. Death conceals it, prevents you from seeing it for what it actually is. And so we are bound in this cycle of duality. The moment you are able to look beyond through a transcendent experience and see what it is that they are hiding, which is the consciousness of immortality. And as you acquire that consciousness, you are no more bound to the requirement of this passage of death, life, cycle. But you have that consciousness in life, freed now from the compulsion of this. What do you do with that freedom? You express that immortality in the life and through the life. But all of that he will describe later. For now we see the importance of this word, preti, and the nature of this passage having a double meaning. At the same time, it is pointing to us that the passage through death is a necessary passage because we have not yet got the true immortality. At the same time, it is telling us that the true immortality is to be gained not by the passage of death, but by the fulfillment of life. But this fulfillment takes place by a breaking through in a transition which is almost like a death. It is a breakthrough, it is a transition to a different consciousness, not a continuity within the same consciousness. So this is the double meaning and the pregnant suggestion. The second word Sri Aurobindo has used here, it is here, he says, ihaiva in Sanskrit. In this mortal life and body, that immortality must be won. Here in this lower Brahman and by this embodied soul, that the higher must be known and possessed. It's not enough that you know it. I can know it in a state of trance and then I come back, I don't have it. To possess it is to have it in your full waking physical consciousness. Sri Aurobindo attained to the supramental consciousness in his inner states by 1914. But after that, his work was to progressively bring it down all the way to the most material part of the consciousness. And while a part of the consciousness, the higher part of the consciousness lives in it, these lower ranges do not have it. And so he worked continuously and brought it successively down until, as you know, in 1926, over mental consciousness was fixed in the physical body, and thereafter the supramental being fixed became the next focus. But this process is what permits the full revealed expression of that higher consciousness. As long as you have it or you have access to it in a specialized state or in a part of your being, it is not yet fully revealed here. And therefore, when he says ihaiva, he says, in this mortal life and body, that immortality must be won, and by that he says, must be known and possessed here in the body. The word ihaiva by referring to it, Sri Aurobindo is forcing us to look back. Where is this word being used? And extraordinarily, we find it is used again and again and again. First of all, it is used in the Veda, where the Vedic Rishi exhorts that Amritam, immortality, must be realized here. And he uses the word Ihaiva. Later, in the Upanishad, we find the Mundaka Upanishad similarly saying, here in this embodied life, that we have to realize the divine. And finally, in the Bhagavad Gita, which comes even after, we find the same word being used to say here in the body, in the life. I will briefly read from the translation that Sri Aurobindo makes of this passage from the Bhagavad Gita. It is in chapter 5 and verse 19. In verse 18, the text simply says, the sages see with an equal eye the learned and the animals and all beings, etc. Verse 19 says, here on earth itself occurred the creation whose mind in equality. The equal Brahman is faultless. Therefore they live in the Brahman. Verse 20. With intelligence stable, unbewildered, the knower of Brahman, living in the Brahman, neither rejoices on obtaining what is pleasant, nor sorrows on obtaining what is unpleasant. And you see, it's a repeat of pretty much the same idea we're dwelling upon. A transcendence and an equality in that transcendence in which the dualities do not affect anymore. But the description is one who is knower of the Brahman, living in the Brahman, but in the body, here on earth itself. Ihaiva tairjita. Ihaiva tairjita sango. So these three references show you the continuity of this idea from the Vedas, through the Upanishads, to the Bhagavad Gita. And if we find in the last 2000 years the idea of an otherworldly realization and a withdrawal from life, it is not central to the spiritual pursuit which has been the foundation for the yoga. It is more a later temporary aberration. So it is here, Ihaiva, in this mortal life and body, that immortality has to be won. What does it mean then, immortality? And he will elaborate later that the immortality is a condition of consciousness, not a location. But we will see that later. Finally, he quotes, if here one finds it not, great is the perdition. And this quotation you will find in the Kena Upanishad itself. Just in case you thought that this is only Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, by finding this similarity of this word preti. And there are people, scholars, who will say, well, that is how he sees it, but it's not what the text says. So Sri Aurobindo makes sure we are pointed to the text also, where in chapter 2, the last and 5th verse says, in Sri Aurobindo's translation, if here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. If here one comes not to the knowledge, then great is the perdition. The wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings, and they pass forward from this world and become immortal. So the same idea here is used. It says, if you don't find it here, then it is a great loss. And perdition is the kind of a loss which is of a fundamental kind, which is as if for eternity you have lost it. The suggestion is this: you can gain to that immortality by abandoning this life and going off into some other state of consciousness. After all, our soul, inmost and highest station, is already there. So all you need to do is drop all this, abandon all this, and lapse back into your source and origin, and you were already there, you never left it. But if you got to that, great is the perdition. That is, you have lost as if forever an opportunity and a knowledge and an experience of a great truth. Because now you know only that truth, you do not know this. And therefore, great is the perdition. But if here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. And here again the Sanskrit word, iha, he says, iha, not ihaiva, but simply iha. And vinashti is for the perdition, the loss. And again here he uses the word preti. When he says, the Upanishad uses the same word preti, the wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings and they pass forward from this world and become immortal. The preti is the pass forward from this world, again used in this verse. So in the Kena Upanishad, preti is explicitly used in the verse that says that you have to attain this knowledge here. Only then you have it. If you do not attain it here, then you have lost something forever. And so Sri Aurobindo quotes this verse, if here one finds it not, great is the perdition. Now it's obvious what the Kena is a realization of the immortality, Amritam, in this life. And so Sri Aurobindo explains how actually the journey of life is really taking us towards that. If we did not have the passage of death, let us assume that somehow the physical, biological life could be extended unendingly. What would be the nature of the growth? Well, you would continue to grow and grow and grow, but would it be forever? There will come a point where, having grown sufficiently, you look back and realize that all the growth that you did so far was of a inferior kind, and what is needed now is a higher, more rapid or a different kind of growth. Now this passage takes place in us many times in our life. As a child, you have perhaps grown up to a certain point where you become conscious of your own thoughts, and then you look back and say, but all of this has brought me to a point where now I can master my own thought. And a new process of self-mastery begins, of self-control. And having acquired that, one reaches a stage where now you can see more deeply and you say, oh, there is something more that I can do, and so on, until there comes that point of transition where you look back not only at this life but perhaps all of the previous lives. Where was all this leading? I have done this so many times. Consider how many times you have taken birth. If you had the memory of it, and even as a recollection, as an idea, you can see how many times you have passed through the passage of births, the passage of learning to walk, the passage of growing up, the passage of struggling against your own emotions and physical instincts, standing back to rise in your own mind, the passages of entering into relationships which bind, the passage of having a whole new family, giving birth once again, growing beyond that, and again, and again, and again. This idea is captured by the life-rejecting philosophies in a kind of a defeatist sense. In Sanskrit they say, again you have to take birth, again you have to die, again you have to take birth, again you have to die, punarapi jananam, punarapi maranam, punarapi, that is again and again and again. Enough, break out of it, end this whole mess. But that's the defeatist attitude. Instead, you look at that and you say, well, something is wrong. All of these are obviously pointing me to a consciousness which is not bound precisely to this cyclic dependency on duality. And so, an effort is made, now I want to break through. Now I want to rise to that which all of this is pointing towards. And that's when begins the true sense of the spiritual life. So this process of rising above and getting free of a level of evolution and then rising to something greater and something higher each time is anyway there implicit in the nature of our growth, because we ourselves are made up of so many levels of consciousness. And as one of them matures enough that it can begin to glimpse the next above, there is automatically this awakening that something else is required. All that we did now was only a preparation for this new step. And so even if you had a continued physical life journey, there would still be this kind of a sense of breaking through. So in any case, the life force within us, being led by the greater life of our life, the divine force itself secretly pushing this life force, it is nudging us in those directions. So he says, the life force in us is led forward by the attraction of the Supreme Life on its path of constant acquisition through types of the Brahman. Each level is only a type of the Brahman. A new level of the Brahman consciousness, a new form of the Brahman consciousness, but it is all Brahman, perhaps inferior levels, inferior forms. And the suggestion here is not only the human life, but also our earlier animal life journeys. And until it reaches a point where it has to go entirely forward, and that's when the breakthrough comes. To go across out of the mortal life, the mortal vision of things, to some beyond, capital B. In the play that the mother wrote, she describes one of the plays that she wrote. It's called The Great Secret, Le Grand Secret, where there's so many different people, each one representing a special facet of the perfection of life. One is an artist, one is a scientist, one is a philosopher, and each one, they're all in a little boat when their ship has sunk and they're sharing their life journey. Each one said, I pursued this, and it is an aspect of the divine. And they reach a point where they couldn't go forward. A limit is reached. And finally there's one who is the mysterious man who says, well, he's the one, the spiritual seeker, he speaks of that which is beyond. A similar idea she has put in another play, which is The Ascent to Truth, is the name, where people are journeying, and at each step, each one falls back from a failure in their consciousness, an insufficiency. The lovers fail at a certain point where they find sufficiency in themselves. Others fail when they cannot overcome their personal ego or some lack. And there are two who reach the highest point, and then they look out, and it is as if a vast opening. They're on the edge of the hill, and below, all around, is this emptiness, and they have to leap. And the leap here is so symbolic, because it means letting go of everything which has been your support, which has been your protection, your safety, your security, even your identity. And the breakthrough takes place when you accept to let go of yourself and all that you are, which includes all that limits you. And that's when the leap happens. So this is symbolized in many different ways in various traditions. So until it reaches a point where it has to go entirely forward, to go across out of the mortal life, the mortal vision of things, to some beyond. And then he says how, as long as we have not passed beyond this duality of life and death, there is this momentary station in the immortality partially. So he says, so long as death is not entirely conquered, this going beyond is represented in the terms of death, and a passing into other worlds where death is not present, where a type of immortality is tasted corresponding to that which we have found here in our soul experience. So here in this very brief statement, he describes in essence the nature of the journey of the passage after death, but also its necessity. First he says that as long as death is not entirely conquered, this going beyond is represented in the terms of the death by passing into other worlds. In other words, when we have overcome the duality of life-death, then that physical passage of death will not be needed. But as long as we have not overcome that and not got to the true immortality in consciousness, well, this becomes a requirement. But what does it lead to? Other worlds where death is not present. Now, if you consider all the gradations of consciousness, from the highest Satchidananda down to the most material, and at least if you look at all the lower worlds of the lower vital, lower mental, higher mental, and still higher ranges of the mind, still not touching the domains of the immortality which are beyond in the unity of consciousness. Across all these domains, you do not see death anywhere except in the gross physical world. Even in the subtle physical world, you do not have the compulsion of death. And therefore, many yogis who do not wish to leave entirely the physical domain, but do not wish to get into this cycle of birth and death, because they want to stay in that poise of consciousness they have attained without having to struggle with the body's limitations each time, they choose to stay in one of these grades of the subtle physical, where the body is now perfect, permanent, without needing to decay or die, and then materialize into the gross physical as and when needed. Such are the stories of so many great yogis or teachers, some of them known to be living in the Himalayas, who are said to be immortal. But it is in a domain that is natural. The moment they rise into a gross body, they are subject to the same process as long as they are in the gross body. And so, if domains, and if you go into the vital or mental worlds, yes, you have the sense of immortality, but he says it is a type of immortality is tasted according to that which we have found here in our soul experience. In other words, the type of immortality and the gradation of immortality that you experience corresponds to your current level of consciousness. So let's say a person living mostly in the sentimental emotional consciousness, where the full personality and the focal point of their existence is on that level. On leaving the physical body, they will enter the worlds corresponding to that level. A type of immortality, but where you are primarily an emotional being with a rudimentary of mental consciousness. Somebody else who has risen above the emotional consciousness, living more in the rational mental consciousness, would then, on leaving the body, enter the domains of the mental worlds corresponding to that level where you were, while embodied. And there experience that partial immortality. But none of these are the true immortality, the Amritam, which the Kena or the Isha or other Vedic texts point to. That immortality is of the consciousness of unity, which is not limited, which is not bound, which is not divided. So that's why he refers to these worlds as other worlds where death is not present, where a type of immortality is tasted corresponding to that which we have found here in our soul experience. But then you notice, effectively you have not yet got to the true Amritam. All you have done is got in body or out of body, but in consciousness terms you are on the same level. Embodied or disembodied. And so you could continue like this with each cycle of birth and death. But when you get to the true Amritam, that's when you have it here. So that's what it points to. But the attraction of death and limitation is not overpassed, because they still conceal something of immortality and infinity, which we have not yet achieved. And he says, therefore there is a necessity of return. So our consciousness is pushed back into the physical body, taking birth again, because an insistent utility of farther life in the mortal body, which we do not overcome until we have passed beyond all types to the very being of the infinite, one and immortal. So each of these levels in our journey is a type of Brahman, a type of psychological or physical consciousness. If you include even our earlier animal births, you can see the form is the type. But in the human births, the psychological condition, the psychological type is our type. But still, that has to continue until we have passed beyond all types to the very being of the infinite, the one and immortal. Now, in our picturing, we point like this to that which is beyond. But where is that? Here, immanent. The greater superconscient existence is here, and it forms this lesser existence as a womb holding the smaller, lesser form in development. And so it is right here that we have to find the very being of the infinite, one and the immortal. And so when we experience that here, it does not require us to leave the body. You can of course have it outside the body, inside the body, but it doesn't matter where you are, on which level, that is still immanent and so can be realized. And when we reach that stage in our journey where we realize, oh, this is it, this is what we are here for, this is what we are meant to realize, this is ourselves that we must recover, that's when we are ready to take that great leap. The text then continues. Sri Aurobindo explains these conditions of consciousness are not geographically located, they are all here. The worlds of which the Upanishad speaks are essentially soul conditions and not geographical divisions of the cosmos. This material universe is itself only existence as we see it when the soul dwells on the plane of material movement and experience, in which the spirit involves itself in form, and therefore all the framework of things in which it moves by the life and which it embraces by the consciousness is determined by the principle of infinite division and aggregation proper to matter, to substance of form. So in other words, we have chosen to focus ourselves into this domain of material movement where our spirit has identified with form, and therefore we experience the world through this lens, perspective of form. We'll study this in greater detail later. But then he says, this becomes then its world or vision of things. And to whatever soul condition it climbs, its vision of things will change from the material vision and correspond to that other condition. And in that other framework, it will move in its living and embrace it in its consciousness. These are the worlds of the ancient tradition. So the idea here is all these worlds are coexistent right now as grades of consciousness. Where we tune in our consciousness and align to is what we see, is what is our vision of things, that becomes our limited world. Now this is a very interesting experience, not commonly had, but had only by those who have developed a continuity of consciousness across all these levels. So it was described to me in this way by one who had attained that kind of mastery. And he said, I was sitting on my sofa looking at this world, And then successively, smoothly, without a break, my consciousness shifted up the levels, and I saw all the worlds one by one as it shifted up until it attained to that highest that he had. And then he shifted back, and all the things shifted back to what he was seeing, back to the physical world. In other words, nothing has moved. The state of consciousness has tuned into its own higher levels, and accordingly, the totality of reality is seen as that state sees and relates to the world. That becomes your vision, that becomes your world, that becomes your domain of experience. As long as we are embodied in a consciousness built up of infinitesimal divisions, we see this world of divided physical consciousness. You shift, and each one of those levels now appears right here as your world, one by one. And if you live in a consciousness which has extended itself across the spectrum, then all these worlds are simultaneously seen, overlaying each other right here. Such was the experience and the normal vision of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And we know through many narrations of the mother herself how she would be meeting somebody on the physical level, in the physical body. At the same time, on the subtle level, she would be meeting other people and interacting with each of them, with each entirely involved, entirely engaged at the same time. But this requires an extraordinary attainment already. As we are in our current state of evolution, we are here at first in a dulled, limited physical, mental consciousness, gradually rising in levels, and with each level we now look upon the world, and the same physical world appears now with new eyes. Oh, now I am so much more conscious. I see so much more deeply. I understand so much better. I relate to people differently, and that is our sense of evolution in the material domain. Thrown out from our gross physical body in the passage of death, we experience the same grade of consciousness of the world, not bound in the physical level only, but in the pure level of consciousness without the dulling of the gross body, experiencing the same level, re-entering the gross body to continue the journey of the ascent, briefly resting to come back. And this is the reason why in the yogic tradition it is said, evolution of consciousness exists only in the physical world. All the other worlds are typal, in that you live and experience them, but you're pretty much bound to what those have. And it is only in the physical consciousness that you have all the higher grades potentially embedded, and therefore able to unravel layer by layer, and awakening while in the body to all the higher levels of consciousness, and therefore able to experience them all in continuity, while still engaged in this domain of matter. So this is the broad sense of the worlds that are described in the ancient traditions. And we will review this last paragraph in some detail for what it relates to in the text of the Kena. The message then being, the highest status of immortality, Satchidananda, is intended to be realized here, ihaiva, in the body, by our consciousness, which is now exceeds the limitations of the body, exceeds the limitations of life force, exceeds the limitations of mind, and is able now to know in identity this domain of oneness. But when that is known, it can imprint itself on all these other levels, and it then permits us to see it, the underlying oneness, the underlying immortality of everything in the cosmos. And not only we are different, our perspective is different. So such is the direction that the Kena Upanishad is exhorting us to grow into. Know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. This means a radical shift in what we pursue. Not pursuing anymore the dualities and the attractions in which our present senses, emotions and thoughts are bound. But turning our gaze to that immortality and pursuing that here with our mind, with our heart, with our senses. It is not a withdrawal, it is the pursuit. But what we pursue is that greater Brahman, not this lesser Brahman. And the whole life changes. We can meditate on this and continue the passage next time. He ends this, just to complete the thought, in the next paragraph. The soul that has entirely realized immortality passes beyond all worlds, beyond all these in-between stages, and is free from frameworks. It enters into the being of the Lord, like the supreme, superconscious self and Brahman. It is not subdued to life and death.